Hello, everyone. You're tuned to An American Atheist. This is episode 102. You can find notes to this show at anamericanatheist.org/episode 102. You can do that with all of our episodes now. And on the show today is myself, Tom. I'm a post-bar practicing criminal defense, and I'm also joined with two Chris's, Chris Thielen and Chris Lazare. Chris Thielen is a computer programmer. Hi, Chris.
Hey.
And Chris Lazare is a teacher. Hi, Chris.
Hello. Hello.
So today we're going to be covering two major topics. First, the Jesus mythicism, or whether or not Jesus was an actual character. And there's a popular article and idea going about by Joseph Atwill that we're going to address. And secondly, we're going to talk about appropriateness in advancing one's own ideology. And we're also going to cover a major story that has been circulating around the net with that as well. But first, we're going to talk about some news. Chris, why don't you tell us what's going on?
Pope Francis expelled German Bishop Franz Peter Tabarts von Elst, age 53, from the diocese on October the 23rd, pending an investigation of a $43 million residential complex he apparently purchased in his name. And this is not the first offense against that bishop. There was actually a petition signed in August and September by over 4,000 people over Tabarts van Elst's overly authoritarian style. So Pope Francis cleaning house a little bit.
Wow, that's expensive. Actually, we actually talked about him on a recent episode, Pope Francis, and how we mostly like him. We did get a lot of feedback, people saying that it's mostly a media hype thing. But they keep coming out with stories like this that I think are grounded in some fact. So I guess I see how people are still not quite giving Pope Francis the A-OK, right, since he still represents the church.
Yeah, and since the church is still backwards, even with what Pope Francis has said.
Didn't he sell that house for $40 million or whatever, $40 million or $40 billion, whatever it was, and turn it into a soup kitchen? Is that the same? Is this the same case, or is this another case?
I hadn't heard of that.
Yeah, I heard that he actually took an archbishop's house, a mansion, and this is about the same. It was like $40 million, and he turned it into a soup kitchen. I don't know how factual that is, but I'm going to look that up to see.
You're correct. That development occurred 4 days ago. He decided to turn it into a soup kitchen. So that actually, first of all, definitely thank you for bringing that up, because that lends sort of fuel to the fire of this idea that there is actually a media blitz going on. I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, but there is an awful lot of good news around the Pope. And as an atheist, I just can't accept good news about the Pope, so I assume it's part of an evil media blitz, surely. No, but so it is something to keep in mind, though. I mean, some of our listeners were offended that we were, saying that we found the Pope to be almost cool with him selling a motorcycle and that sort of thing. So, do remember that he is cool relative to the positions of the Catholic Church, as of 2 years ago, but they still have a hell of a long way to go.
Right.
Also in the news, a Tennessee judge ruled recently that a baby who could not be named Messiah, given that name was, in his own thoughts, reserved for Jesus Christ, has been found guilty of judicial misconduct, and his ruling has been found unconstitutional. And this news development has been found by this panel to be unsurprising and monotonous.
Yeah, not surprised at all, actually.
And last, the Air Force honor oath has removed "So help me God." It's become an optional phrase. And this is part of a couple of news items that didn't really crack the surface for us. But if you were an atheist in the Air Force, congratulations.
We were also talking about a kind of book club we were going to be doing, and our first segment was actually a video. So we're going to talk about some sort of written material now. So if you guys are interested, you listeners out there, we're going to be talking a little bit about Sam Harris's free will pamphlet in a couple weeks. Probably have it read by the 19th if you want to hear our discussion on it, which should be lively. I think that Sam Harris, however wrong he might be in many other areas of his life, I think he's a smart person and a good writer.
Yeah, and as far as I can tell, you can find this book almost anywhere. We don't need to plug any specific outlet, but if you want to buy the paper version, the digital version, the audiobook version, it seems to be widely available. So you shouldn't have too much trouble getting your hands on it.
And we will gear the discussion towards people who have not read it and just discuss some of the ideas in it. So we will address it, not assuming that you've read it as well.
Right. So if you don't care to be in a book club, it'll still make for a good show regardless. Yeah, it's important.
So our first topic was about basically, is Jesus a real person? And this is sort of a beaten to death topic, I think, in the community. Because ultimately, I think the answer is, well, it doesn't matter. It matters whether or not he's divine. But Joseph Atwill came out with some news PR stuff, or his PR people have, stemming from his work from a while ago called Caesar's Messiah. And this is basically going through explaining that basically Jesus was not a real person and a fabrication of the Roman Empire. And I think, Chris Lazare, I think you had seen this as well. What did you think about it when you first saw this?
I'm familiar with Dr. Richard Carrier's work, so the idea of Jesus being a myth has always been fascinating to me. When I saw Caesar's Messiah, I was interested in looking more into it, but then I started to read a whole bunch of different reviews on it, and I saw a lot of his claims were actually debunked, including by people including Dr. Richard Carrier. But I mean, even if the claim, and I know we talked a little bit earlier about being right because we need to be right about certain things, not just to say that Jesus was made up, but the idea that Jesus was an invented being, I think, is a interesting topic that I think needs to be discussed a little bit more, even though it might have been beaten up already enough in the atheist community, but I think there's still so much there to be discussed. So I hope we can get that today.
I think it's really important to be right for the right reasons. Like, like it's like Joseph Atwill, from what I can gather, is mostly making baseless assertions that Jesus was a fabrication of the Roman Empire. Right. Because I think the typical atheist position is that it's an amalgamation of fictional things or oral tradition, maybe mixed in with some sort of real characters that make up this different character of Jesus. And I mean, frankly, I don't even really care if he's a real person. There could have been someone who was, 1/50th of who later becomes Jesus Christ in the New Testaments,
Yes.
So his claims, Joseph Atwood's claims, have to do with a sort of well-known parallel between the Gospel of Luke and, is it Josephus?
Josephus. Yeah, Joseph Atwill is trying to. One of his main arguments. He's got a number, and people are free to review this themselves as well. There's a really good criticism by J.T. Eberhard. Also, David Fitzgerald has some good criticism of it, and Richard Carrier, all on their blogs. But basically, there's some parallels between how Josephus is writing about some history, because he's one of the earliest historians from that time period, how he's writing and how the New Testament appears. And this sort of similarity is one of the bases for Atwill saying that Jesus is really a fabrication of the Roman Empire used to pacify the Jews, or something like that. And that kind of flies in the face of all of the modern scholarly evidence about when we think these manuscripts date from, and our entire historical understanding of the time period doesn't make sense. There's some fabrications I know in Josephus about later Christians, I think, altering Josephus's texts. So Josephus has a bunch of mixed up manuscripts anyway, and so it's not a surprise that people are going to talk about that. And actually, Eberhard actually references some people who have done some work. For example, I believe it was Thomas Verena in his post. He references talking about how there's a massive. Actually, no, I'm sorry. It's Stephen Mason, who has a really good comparison of how this discrepancy or this similarity between Josephus and the New Testament actually does occur, and talks about it. But the statements that Atwill makes doesn't make any sense. Actually, Richard Carey, you brought up, has 8 points about why Atwill's stuff doesn't make any sense. And the first one has to do with, just the cleverness of the Roman aristocracy. It just seems kind of like an elaborate plot. And this leads into, because you guys know how the Gospels were selected, right?
Yeah.
And wasn't there a council of elders of sorts led by the Romans who decided which Gospels would be included in the New Testament?
Yeah, I believe it's the Nicene convention or something like that. But basically, they're all selected which gospels are going to work.
Which
and
was
this
like a
happens,
4th century council,
right?
Right.
That's
like
exactly the point.
Early Christianity was like a bunch of tribes, if you will, that sort of didn't get along.
Yeah.
Right. That's exactly the point. It happens much later. And so the fact that there's similarities between Josephus and the canonical gospels, the ones we say are cool and valid, there's lots of other gospels and religious texts written that were not included. And so
some of them are the basis of great metal albums. I mean, there's a lot of them. In all seriousness, there are some dark ones with some weird stuff about like Jesus and Satan and stuff that were obviously left out for almost PR reasons back in the day or something like that. And, the validity of all of these is dubious. But if you ever have a lot of time on your hands and feel like reading rejected gospels, it can make for interesting times.
Right. Yeah, the Gospel of even Judas. I remember I was watching a special on that. I don't know if you guys caught that. I think it was on History or Discovery. They have the Gospel of Judas, and apparently it shows Jesus having fun, like smiling and laughing and cracking jokes, which is ironic since it is Judas. But anyways, go on.
What's more surprising is that something like that was on the History Channel and not about aliens or something like that.
Or Hitler and aliens working together to build pyramid spaceships
Right, yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. And so Richard Carrier also says that, Jesus could have been an intentional fabrication, but it's more likely that it would be created by someone like Paul, which it makes a lot more sense, right? Because Paul sends letters to all the Christians, and actually that gets put into the Bible as well, the epistles of Paul, basically telling them what to do and how to do it. And so, it makes more sense that if a Jew were trying to, fabricate someone to direct people or pacify people, that makes more sense rather than the Romans fabricating this also.
And does he not bring up one of his pieces is that in terms like there wasn't really a great need to pacify for the Romans to pacify the Jews in the first 2 centuries. There were 2 skirmishes lasting maybe 10 years, which is relatively peaceful for that period.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. There wasn't a huge amount of conflict.
Yeah.
And there was mostly an agreement, since they had older gods, basically, that the Romans would just leave them alone. And with a polytheistic religion, there was less tension as compared to what we get with the monotheistic religions that come out of it.
There's an interesting parallel there between like the 2-party political system and the political systems that have multiple parties in terms of the amount of friction you get when you have a binary problem versus a greater order problem. But that's tangential.
Are you bringing campaign finance reform into our atheist
discussion? No, I'm just wasting everybody's time with incredibly fascinating side note.
Atwill also brings up a point about the kind of Messiah that they expected, the kind of Messiah the Jews expected, because Jews obviously don't think that Christ is the Messiah, but Christians do think that he is the Messiah. There's this idea that the Jews expected a different kind of Messiah, like a warrior Messiah or a dominating, powerful Messiah. And then you get, the meek and meager Jesus who comes instead. But I don't think that that's a problem. I think that if you look at thematic stories throughout time, sometimes you get the opposite of what's expected in a story. Or Jesus is powerful, but in different ways that you wouldn't expect. That makes him all the greater. So I don't really buy that argument falls really flat for me, that Atwill's making.
What also do you think drives his argument in the first place?
Yeah, where would this idea even come from?
Yeah, why does he care? Why does he care to not only state this argument, but state it in the way that he does?
J.T. Eberhard sort of says, look, this guy's not a historian, doesn't understand how historians work or think, and just has a theory and is trying to pass it off as legitimate when he just came up to this idea in an unfounded way.
So he's a conspiracy theorist. He falls in love with his own ideas and their idiosyncrasies, you think?
That's what Eberhard thinks, and that might be true. I don't really know if I doubt this person's sincerity. I just think it's really implausible that for those reasons Jesus is made up.
Sure. Well, if he is a conspiracy theorist, he would be sincere.
Right.
Now, what about the actual? Now, what I'm more interested in talking about, or I like to hear, is about the actual existence of Jesus. Now we could kind of expand it to Richard Carrier's thesis and things like that. I mean, do you think that there was a person named Jesus, even that existed, even if he wasn't divine? Or what do you think the implications would be for religion across the board if there wasn't anybody that even existed by the name of Jesus? Do you think that it makes much of a difference?
I think it makes no difference at all. The sole question that matters is whether or not this character was divine. If there are some people who think, for example, you bring up the Richard Carrier position. There's some people who think who are historians, like Ehrman, for example. Bart Ehrman thinks that Jesus was a real person. Actually, Ehrman is positive, almost, that Jesus was a real person. And he calls himself an agnostic. Actually has some really good debates with William Lane Craig and some other people about the divinity of Jesus. So, there's popular positions on both from historians, I think, from what I can gather. And yeah, I don't know for certain. I would say it's probably a fabrication. I mean, if you look at the time after Jesus' lifetime in which these were written, it takes a long time for these people to start writing and circulating these documents. And in other areas of our history, we don't really have that much of a delay. I don't know. I just don't find it very plausible that he was a real person. At the end of the day, obviously I don't care a ton, but it is interesting to think about. I think probably not real, but I don't really know.
See, for some odd reason, from my perspective, I think it means a lot more than just nothing. The only reason why I say that is because if as atheists and or agnostics, we are trying to combat religion as a whole, one of the biggest ways that we could combat Christianity is to actually historically prove that there was no Jesus. There was no such being as Jesus. So I think that if we could coalesce around a theory and say, okay, this happened. If we follow the historical record, we see that, okay, there was nobody named Jesus. Then there puts even more of a burden on the believers. So sooner or later, that would have to, I would imagine, hopefully logic will prevail, to cave in on Christianity as a whole. And you could, maybe this is just me being overly optimistic, but destroy that whole religion within itself, because you're taking out the essential piece of that religion.
Well,
does that make sense?
I understand. That makes quite a bit of sense. But my problem with that, though, is that, well, what you're saying, if we could demonstrate that would be great. The problem is you shoulder a very large burden when you're trying to disprove something from that far ago.
Yeah.
And so, like, for example, even Richard Carrier, when he's talking about Atwill's reasons for why Jesus might be a myth, has to say, like, look, I cannot disprove these things, but here are a number of reasons to make it extremely unlikely about what he's saying. Yeah. Because when you're talking about stuff that's that far long ago, it's hard to disprove, especially, much less prove things.
Right.
So I think it's too much of a burden to try and take on. I mean, and also there are many clear-cut things. For example, it depends on the kind of religious person you're dealing with. If you're dealing with the kind of religious person who's dating the age of the earth based on the Bible, or at least what people say that it is, that the earth is 6,000 years old, we can clearly, easily, demonstrably show that is not so. There's lots of other things we could do with that as well. And those are clear-cut things, and to take something as intangible or malleable as a person who might have inspired these stories that may or may not have been real, it seems like a more difficult, harder to formalize approach than those other approaches that I would think would work just as well if you were going to confront people with hard, cold facts. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
right.
No, I definitely understand.
Plus, don't underestimate the ability of this particular culture to pick and choose how they apply source material to a philosophical outlook. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if there was some if you ever develop such evidence, the sort of yoga positions that the culture could maintain their philosophy with wouldn't surprise you.
Yeah, have you guys seen the movie, or the documentary, I should say, The God Who Wasn't There?
I have seen it. Yes.
that movie right there, when I first, because that was the first time I was actually introduced to the concept that Jesus might not have even existed. So I was kind of like shook by it, and I think there were a lot of compelling arguments from, just like we already mentioned, the idea of, the Gospels being written 30, 40 years after. Some of the arguments or some of the letters that Paul was writing in Acts and Romans regarding Jesus being a supernatural being, Paul never writing about Jesus actually being on earth. He never mentions any of the miracles, things of that nature. I don't know. I find all that stuff, to be thought-provoking at the very least. That
Right.
it could prove to be useful in a debate against any religious person, or Christian, I should say.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I think that a lot of atheists come to questions like this with a lot of curiosity, because you see so many people caring so much about these topics. And indeed, I think I agree with fundamentalists in a sense that I think these are central topics. If there is a God, or if Jesus is the Son of God and was sent to this planet to give us a message, I think that's really important, whether or not that's true. I think it's false. So, I think that those are central questions that too much of society says, like, oh, well, we all just think what we're going to think. And I'm not saying, be an ass about it, but I think they're really important questions. And I think that's why a lot of us find so much interest in delving into those details about, how do these things come about. But I don't think, the average Christian cares so much about the historical context leading up to it. Because I think a lot of people have experiential Christianity. They feel and experience these things, or they experience Jesus Christ themselves, or they have a family community. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I genuinely believe they think that they're experiencing these things. There's lots of things that people experience, and I wouldn't discredit them. But yeah, no, I think it is very fascinating, and. Yeah, I don't know. I think that I would like our education system to include more stuff like that. The historic perspective on the origins of religions. And I think we should have more, like a whole class dedicated to it in public high school, actually, would probably be good, about religions.
And not to mention, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but from all the research that I've done so far, I mean, outside of Josephus, there isn't really any other mention of Jesus in any other document outside of the Bible and obviously the Quran, right? Or am I incorrect?
I don't believe so.
That?
I don't believe so. I mean, but the Gospels do have separate writers too, though. So and at different time periods. But yeah, outside of the text, I don't think there's anyone who really that it comes to mind that references Jesus or those facts. And of course, there's contradictions throughout the Gospels, especially when you talk about important accounts like the resurrection and the tomb. You have lots of differences that you would think those alone would raise suspicion. It reminds me of the Ehrman Craig debate when they talk about Jesus' resurrection from the perspective of the Gospels, and which is more likely or not, or not. That he rose from the dead or that he didn't. So.
Interesting.
The next topic that we're going to discuss is it kind of relates to how we're talking about how to address people who have a different position, and this has to do with how you approach and how you deal with your ideology. There was a recent article going around the internet about a young girl whose name was Maria Kiselo, whose father died in 2009. She's a young Polish girl, and her parents were telling her that, her one remaining parent, unfortunately, was telling her, your father's in a better place, he's in heaven now. This is what, you tell children all the time, I think, when you're raising these kinds of households, so that they can cope with it, right? Mm-hmm. And then one day they went in and they found the daughter, she was hanging because she had killed herself because she wanted to be with her father. And it turns out that some of the story might be fabricated. Actually, I think the Mirror kind of came out with it and said, and the Daily Mail, saying that it may or may not be true. So I don't know how accurate this story is, and that maybe we can delve into that a little bit too. But I think the more important thing is I've read a lot of comments on the internet about this, and in fact, some of the articles that were publishing this were basically saying, look at religion, isn't that awful? That's what led to the death of this little girl and her suicide. So what do you guys think about that? And does that sort of presentation leave a bad taste in your mouth? What do you think?
Well, if they're using it, if the atheist community, and we're all humans, right? We could use mistakes and try to advance our ideology through lies and false reports. If whoever was disseminating this information and they knew it was a lie, just for the reason of saying that religion is bad, to me that's not advancing our cause, and that just tarnishes the atheist name even further in American society, because we already have a bad name. You know, atheists already get a bad rap. So using this, especially if it's not true, is not the way that we should be going.
That seems to me the easier question, though. What if they have a good faith thought that it is a true story, and then they advance their position that way?
So what you're saying, if it is a true story?
If someone thinks, or other stories like this, I don't mean to isolate it just to this story, because I think that if this story is correct, that it's a very heartbreaking, tragic story. But other similar stories, which indeed are real and happen all the time, do you think that those isolated incidents, do you think talking about those and directly saying, like, look, this is what's wrong, is wrong? Or do you think there's other ways we could deal with it? What do you think about that?
No, I think if the story is true, and it's just, not this incident, but if there's a story out there that shows how religion has directly harmed an individual or caused an individual to hurt themselves, yeah, of course, you have to expose it. You have to call it for what it is. I mean, that would be like, for example, if I don't want to get too sensationalized here, but if we want to talk about 9/11, for example, people flying planes into a building, we'll say that, yeah, was that related to Islam or radical Islam? Absolutely. So that's something that we need to confront as the atheist community head on. However, if it isn't true, using it and saying that, just like this story, if it isn't true, then that is wrong. You know what I'm saying?
I understand what you're saying.
This reminds me a little bit of a topic I've been thinking about a bit, which is what is the point of the atheist media in general? And I think that stories like this, which I believe the truth. Well, I shouldn't use that word, but it appears that perhaps the girl did hang herself, but didn't actually leave a suicide note, and there's no evidence that religion had anything to do with it, which still makes it a tragic story. But nonetheless, stories like this, like where atheist podcasts or atheist websites essentially seem to be using theistic-based tragedies to give themselves fuel, is it childish of us, or does it allow us to collate a catalog of materials with which we can formulate theories about our philosophy, or better understand what's wrong with counter philosophies like Christianity? And I don't have an answer necessarily to that question.
I think that I think it's a hard question. I agree.
Yeah, I do want to say that it does leave a bad taste in my mouth when I see a website or listen to a podcast that merely offers a news article which almost seems to show the deprivations of a Christian, for instance, perhaps a young girl hanging herself to be with her father, and just points out the tragedy without developing any sort of philosophical understanding of what that implies, without sort of taking one more step. I mean, it's not that having a news source is unimportant, but I feel like without context, I don't know what people are supposed to be gaining. I don't know why they listen. I don't know why they read.
Right. Yeah, I think it is a little bit difficult question, and how you walk that line. I do think it's useful to, because if we can't talk about the really hard things that I think has actually led many of us to come to our positions about religion, then what's the point? But I think the most important thing is, when you're talking about these issues, I think people should have some sympathy and understanding, and calibrate it towards who they're talking to, right? Mm-hmm. Because I think I've seen a lot of callousness, and of course on the internet you'll see nothing but callousness about how people presented this issue or other issues with, the family, for example. If in this story, if it indeed is true, or other stories that are actually true, the families or other people don't, I think, mean harm. And it's such a poor, terrible thing. So I don't know. It's a complicated mess, and I think they're valid things to bring up, but it requires some tact.
Yeah, I mean, to add on to what I was saying, I mean, if religion is one of those things in American society, especially, that is basically free from criticism. I mean, if you criticize religion, you're being insensitive, so on and so forth, even if something is blatantly wrong. So, I mean, if we see a religion doing something crazy like Scientology, it doesn't even have to be Christianity, Scientology or something like that, we should be able to call it out, even if it's just one instance or not. And if it doesn't even have to further our cause as atheists. All we have to do is say this is ridiculous. We don't have to say, so you shouldn't believe. You know what I'm saying? You could just say, okay, well, this is what this cult did, or this is what this church did, like Westboro Baptist Church. We're not telling you to be atheists. We're just telling you to be mindful that there are people who identify with your religion and that are using your religion to bash gay people or picket soldiers' funerals, things of that nature.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't know. I wonder how much culpability to assign to people, because in one sense, and of course I assign a lot, so it's just sort of a philosophical question, right? If you look at people like who are homophobic, they're kind of that way because of a product of their environment. Their families raised them that way. Their culture brought them up that way. And so I have some level of sympathy. Obviously, I'm very hostile to homophobia. And so, it's kind of a complicated problem that leaves me a little frustrated. I think that, of course, when I say you need to calibrate, how you're talking to somebody, I calibrate to the most hostile when I'm talking to homophobic people. But, I think that those are some good points. Mm-hmm.
It is true that the same sort of insensitivity that we might detect in the position of a Christian, say, if they assume that the world revolves around Christianity, by being blatantly offensive to them is also a philosophical centric view upon yourself. They're both egocentric views. So I don't think we get very far by being vile or contemptuous, even if unintentionally. I do think you have to understand, as you were hinting at, Tom, the cultures that people are deriving their values from, and to understand that it's not so easy. These people aren't necessarily rejecting evidence. They may not even accept it in the first place to have it in processing. So you have to be compassionate. What would Jesus do?
Well, the thing is, I completely understand. I mean, we have to be compassionate, and I think I'm not sure about your history with Christianity, but I came, from the religion for 19 years, born and raised in a Christian school, the whole nine. And I tell you, during that time, if somebody even brought up they're not being a God or not believing in God, without him even having, saying F God or you're stupid, I already felt some type of contempt towards that person. I already felt that person was insulting me, just by by that individual expressing a different belief set than me. So even if we could, the reason why I'm saying that, we could tread lightly and say, okay, I'd like to discuss your religion with you. Not everybody is going to be an academic and sit down at a debating table with you and discuss the reasons why they believe in God, and so on and so forth. A lot of people, if you want to have this discussion with you, they're going to listen for a minute, and then once you say something that they've probably never heard before, they're just going to get angry and say that you're insulting them. So what do you do with that?
Yeah, I think that sort of goes to we've talked about it before on the show, this sort of different approaches, right? Because I think that if you sort of just get down to it, I think kind of like when you talk about the historicity of Jesus too, do you go straight to whether or not Jesus was even a real person, or did you go on the edges and try and chip away from the outside? Likewise, do Do you take a George Carlin approach, and I think he's fairly upfront and blunt about it, or do you sit back and ask a couple subtle questions? I think all those approaches are necessary because it takes I think a bunch of a bombardment from multiple sources to really shake that foundation.
Yeah, I don't think there's an easy answer because it's a question of changing culture, and culture is inherently made up of, thousands or millions of little units, and who knows what the individual motivations are.
Yeah.
So it's just, tough luck.
Right.
Good luck, I guess. If if it's in reference to, say, a family member or someone that you argue with frequently, it's probably going to be grueling.
I think, though, we're talking about like these sad stories, right? Or 9/11 or individual instances, lots of these things. I also, the idea occurs to me is like, look, if you look at the rate at which atheism is growing, it's very quick. And certainly in a couple decades, it's going to be even bigger. I just think that eventually in Western society, unless something awful happens, we'll be a majority. And that's probably a good thing, or at least we'll have one position that's correct.
It does seem to have joined what I can only assume are, accelerated topics, accelerated by the communications age, by people having internet access, like acceptance of gay marriage, maybe like acceptance of an anti, pot prohibition. Like, it seems like you can lump those sort of things together as, as people gain greater access and easier access to knowledge, these things just sort of proliferate on their own sort of basis. I don't want to lump them all together because I'm sure there are, people who are, I'm sure there are homophobic atheists out there who would disagree with my statement or something like that.
Right.
I think that idea brings up an interesting thing that Bill Maher said a few weeks ago about atheism, and is going to be the new gay marriage. Like, people that come out as non-believers will be the equivalent of coming out of the closet, because apparently Bill Maher says that these people are scared to come out because they could be demonized, they could lose their family, their friends, even their jobs.
Totally.
So what do you think about that?
No,
do you think that is the next big thing?
I don't know if it's the next big thing, but I wouldn't be surprised if the atheism breaking through the surface takes a very similar shape as he suggests. That wouldn't surprise me. I don't know, when or how, but it's probably, I would imagine, sooner rather than later, before we die, I should hope.
It seems like the bubbling up of that has already kind of started in certain respects.
I mean, people didn't even, as far as I know, really even mention atheism on television in like the 50s or 60s, and now you can even find atheists being interviewed on Fox News. So like, atheists are in people's faces, maybe not on a daily basis, but you can't, it's hard to be ignorant of the topic, nowadays.
Yeah.
And, certainly you don't get, if someone kicks you out of your, military organization or school over it, the litigation is readily available. So we'll see. We could take bets, you want to put some money on a date, of a certain pupil. I don't know.
Well, those are really difficult questions, and I think that listeners, if you guys have ideas about, what is your preferred method? Do you challenge people on the periphery and let them sort of stew about it, or do you go at the foundations of sort of what you think when you talk to them? And what do you think about the appropriateness of handling difficult or personal subjects? For example, I think a big issue is, when loved ones die, or you're talking about things like that with people I think you should be a little kinder with those people. But let us know what you think about that. And you can find our contact form at americanatheist.org. And next time, actually, we'll be probably discussing the free will pamphlet by Sam Harris, or if not next time, very soon, probably by the 19th.
I like how the pamphlet language caught on. It's really not a pamphlet. It's like 100 pages. But
yeah, it's
novella.
Pretty big. We were calling it a pamphlet.
Yeah. I also want to throw in just since you mentioned the contact form, this is in all seriousness. If folks want to write in and let us know what they like or don't like about the podcast or atheist media in general, or what they look for in atheist media, if they look for news or if they look for philosophical discussions, I am genuinely curious about it, because we're sort of in the dark about it. We just sort of do it because we like to do it, and it's great that people listen along. But I'm genuinely curious, so feel free to use our contact link for that purpose too.
Right. And if you think I was too much of a religious apologist in this episode, you can yell at me.
Yeah, I love it when people yell at us. Yeah, that's good.
Because I'm not, I don't think.
I don't know, man. Between the Pope and this conversation, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think
Look,
Billy Graham is coming out with a new sermon. I don't know if you want to go up there and talk with him.
The Pope. I wish I had a clever example for what the Pope is the best of a worst of something, but I don't have it. So but I think it's a good direction. So if you like the show, rate us on iTunes or check us out, and feel free to subscribe to us.
It helps. It helps spread the word. Actually, those iTunes ratings, they're good.
Yeah, it does. So that'll be it for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Let us know what you think. And I am Tom. I was joined with Chris Thielen and Chris Lazare, and we'll see you next time.